There are times in life where all hope seems lost, where you are surrounded by darkness and perhaps end up thinking, where is God? Maybe you've been there, maybe you're there this morning. Certainly Ruth and Naomi were there. But usually when God seems most absent is actually when He is most at work. And that is so apparent in Ruth chapter 2. In Ruth chapter 2, God shows His plan for a radical redemption of Ruth and Naomi, and that redemption is a portrait of the redemption we've received in Christ. Here's the take-home message. When all hope seemed lost, God sent my Redeemer. When all hope seemed lost for us, when we were alienated from God by our sin, lost and without hope in the world, God sent us a Redeemer. His name is Jesus. And when we look at the life of Boaz, we actually see a portrait of Christ. We're going to start in Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. Ruth and Boaz meet. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Who is Boaz? Well, Boaz, his name literally means "in him is strength." And the Bible calls him a worthy man. Now, if the Bible calls you a worthy man, that's a pretty good compliment. You are a very worthy man. That word worthy, it means a man of valor, a man of substance, a man of worth or excellence. It also speaks of a man of strong position and wealth. In other words, Boaz was your quintessential secure provider. If it's true that a wife values security, Boaz was someone who could provide security in all facets of life. And then we get this interesting detail about Boaz where it says that he was a relative of Naomi's husband of the clan of Elimelech. And why is that important? Well, we're going to see that this allows Boaz to play the part of the Redeemer or Kinsman-Redeemer. More on that later. In verse 2, though, it turns back to Ruth and Naomi, and Ruth is given this title, Ruth the Moabite. Don't miss that. That's an important title. That title is given to Ruth throughout the book of Ruth, and it is a foretaste of God's mercy toward Gentiles or non-Jews. In fact, a Moabite woman through Boaz will be included in the lineage of Christ. Think about that. Moabites were not highly respected people in Jewish culture. This is a foreign woman, but she's going to be included in the lineage of Christ. And so Ruth the Moabite begins talking to her mother-in-law, and she asks her mother-in-law if she can go out and glean in the fields for them. Now, why did she do that? Well, let's keep in mind that Ruth and Naomi are in a desperate situation. I mean, they've lost all the men in their life in a society where the men provided for the women. But one thing I love about Ruth is she didn't just sit around and sulk. She had every reason to sulk. I mean, think about what these women had been through. And Ruth could have just sat there, but she didn't do that. She got up and she started to move. And when we get up and we start to move, even when it's hard, God starts to move. And God is moving in the background because Ruth, as she's wandering through the fields looking for a place to find sustenance, whose field does she wander into? Boaz, this distant relative of Naomi. And so she's out in this field. It says she is working from early morning up until now, except for a short rest. And here comes this man, Boaz. And the first look that Boaz gets at Ruth is not when Ruth is all done up, with makeup, out on a first date, having dinner. That's not how they meet. They meet with Boaz looking out to the field, and Ruth is working, and she is working hard. Don't you love that? I mean, Ruth, so in keeping with her character, is not so concerned about how she looks at the time. She's concerned about providing for Naomi. And here is Boaz, who's an older man. He's a godly man. He's clearly a man who is diligent and high in character himself. And I bet the first thing he noticed about Ruth wasn't just how she looked. He might have liked that too. But probably her character, how hard she worked. And so Boaz is looking out at the field, and now he's going to have an interaction with Ruth. How will Boaz respond to Ruth? Let's look at verse 8. Boaz and Ruth honor each other. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then Ruth fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to Boaz, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then Ruth said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime Boaz said to Ruth, "Come here and eat some of the bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now, there's a lot there, but what I want you guys to notice in these verses is a beautiful courting, dating type relationship moment between a very godly man and a very godly woman. And it has a lot to teach us about what it means to have a godly relationship. And so I want to share with you guys 3 ways that Boaz honored Ruth here, and then 3 ways that Ruth honored Boaz. And all the men and women in here, we have something to learn from this. So let's start with Boaz. Boaz honored Ruth by protecting her. Boaz says in verse 8 to Ruth, "Do not go and glean in another field, but keep close to my young women." Why would Boaz say that? Well, later in Ruth 2, Naomi tells her the same thing so that she won't be assaulted in the field. Ruth was a young woman, and she was also a foreign woman. And so she was vulnerable. And this is Boaz keeping his eye on Ruth to make sure that she is protected, because godly men protect women. Godly men protect the vulnerable. And so we see that character quality with Boaz. He is protecting Ruth. He even takes, I love this in verse 9, he takes his young men aside and he literally charges them, which is a strong word, "Don't you dare touch Ruth." And so we see Boaz's character in how he's taking care of this young Moabite woman. So Boaz honored Ruth by protecting her. Then Boaz honored Ruth by praising her godliness. Notice that Boaz doesn't start by saying, "Ruth, you are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." I don't think she would have hated that. Most women wouldn't hate that. But that's actually not where he starts. He starts by praising her godly character. He says, "All that you've done for Naomi has been told to me, and how you left your land and your family and came and became a worshiper of the God of Israel and have cared for Naomi." In other words, he's saying, "Ruth, I love how godly you are. I am attracted to how godly you are." Think about this. What if in all of our dating relationships, what if for our young people, the first thing they gravitated towards, praised in each other, was not simply looks, but godliness? Wouldn't that be a great start to a relationship? Now, I'm not saying being attracted physically doesn't matter, but I'm saying there's something special about how Boaz and Ruth honor each other's godliness first. I think there's a lesson there. So Boaz honored Ruth by praising her godliness. Now here's the final one. Boaz honored Ruth by providing for her. So he has her sit down. He has her dip her bread in a morsel of bread in the wine. She ate until she was satisfied and had some left over. And then he even has her go out and glean even more among the sheaves. And one thing you need to notice about Boaz here is he is going beyond the requirements of the Old Testament law in caring for Ruth. In the Old Testament law, it was stipulated that the poor, the sojourner, the widow, the orphan, that they should be able to go through the fields, typically in the corners or borders, and that the people who owned the land should leave some sustenance for them. Well, look what Boaz is doing. He says, leave out bundles for her. She's walking probably right through the middle of the field, collecting bundles, and so we see Boaz is really taking care of young Ruth. And so there's lessons there for men, all right, for us men. Godly men are providers and they're protectors. And they also honor the godliness in women. Okay, so Boaz honored Ruth. Let's talk about how Ruth honored Boaz. Ruth honored Boaz by respecting him. So Ruth, in response to the kindness of Boaz, she fell on her face, verse 10, bowing to the ground. In verse 13, she refers to him as my Lord, which is just a title of reverence. And, you know, it is so important in relationships that godly men and women respect each other, isn't it? I mean, when we lose respect for each other, it's hard to have a good relationship. And Ruth has no sense of entitlement here. She is fully appreciative in her verbals and her nonverbals of what Boaz is doing for her. And it's a beautiful sight, how she respects him. Ruth also honored Boaz by praising his godliness. She didn't start by saying, Boaz, you're 6'3", you have a job, and you are fine. No, that's not where she starts. She says, Boaz, you are so godly. I see how you're going beyond the requirements of the law to care for me. That me, a foreigner, that I have found favor in your eyes. You didn't have to do that, Boaz. You've been kind to me, and I respect that in you. And she says, you have comforted me and spoken kindly to me like I'm one of your servants, even though I'm not one of your servants. And so this is Ruth repaying the favor and first pointing out in Boaz, I love your godly character. So Ruth honored Boaz by praising his godliness. The final one here, Ruth honored Boaz by providing for Naomi. Now, Naomi was a distant relative of Boaz. And so Boaz cares not only about Ruth, he cares about Naomi. And he gives Ruth an opportunity to go out into the field and to care for Naomi. And Ruth, in keeping with her character, she doesn't do it halfway. It says that she is gleaning in the field until evening. Now, she'd started early in the morning. She'd taken almost no rest. And now she's going clear into the evening and providing for her mother-in-law. And that was also a way to honor Boaz. Now, it says she gleaned an ephah of barley. How many know how much an ephah is? Meg, only you, Meg. No, seriously, I didn't expect many people to know what that is. Here's what it is, a huge amount, to be specific. 22 liters, yeah, I checked. Basically what this is a 2-week supply for the two women of food. And this is a culture where many people did not even know where their next meal was coming from. It's called subsistence living culture. And so Ruth, she's got 2 weeks of food. That'd be hard to even carry home. But there's a beauty in her work ethic, in her diligence, and in the way she provides for Naomi. And so let me recap this. Boaz provided for Ruth, praised Ruth for her godliness, and protected Ruth. And Ruth respected Boaz, praised Boaz for his godliness, and provided for Naomi. Let's turn now and let's talk about Naomi, because she's a big part of this story. We're going to call this Naomi Experiences New Hope. Look at verse 18. And so Ruth took up the ephah of barley and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and that Ruth also brought out and gave to her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And Naomi said to Ruth, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to Ruth, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, Boaz said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.' And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted.' So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law." Now, when Naomi sees what Ruth has gleaned, her jaw just must have dropped, that she had this much food. And so she says, "Blessed is the person who let you take this much food home." And she asks Ruth, "Where did you glean today?" And then Ruth says something really interesting, something that would have definitely caught Naomi's attention. "I gleaned in the field of a man named Boaz." Now, this is where hope really starts to pick up for Naomi. It's been a tough go for Naomi, wouldn't you say? I mean, Ruth chapter 1 was a very tough chapter for Naomi. And now hope is starting to spring up because I think she's starting to see the plan of God. And here's one thing I know about you moms. When it comes to matchmaking your sons and your daughters, you guys are like 4, 5, 6, 7 steps out ahead of everyone. And so when Naomi hears the name Boaz, I guarantee you those wheels started turning. She's going, Ruth is single, Boaz is single. And then she points out something interesting. She says this man Boaz is one of our redeemers. And so she tells Ruth to stay in the field of Boaz the rest of the year. And what does that mean? Boaz is one of our redeemers. Well, to understand that, you got to understand the Old Testament idea of what's called a kinsman-redeemer. The kinsman-redeemer was stipulated in the Old Testament law as a figure that in many ways could redeem other family members and close relatives. So let me give you a few things a kinsman-redeemer could do. First, the kinsman-redeemer could redeem a family member sold into slavery. Now, if a family member became poor and they had to sell themselves to a stranger, the redeemer could come along and purchase back that family member. And for Ruth and Naomi, they had not yet fallen into slavery, but certainly we might say they were at risk of that. They were in a really desperate condition. They didn't have anybody to provide for them. And what a redeemer could do is protect them from slavery. Another thing a kinsman-redeemer could redeem is land that needed to be sold under financial distress. And so we're going to find out in Ruth chapter 4 that Naomi was going to have to sell her family land. And one thing a redeemer could do is show up and purchase that land to keep it in the family. And this is an agricultural society. So losing your land was a big deal. But a kinsman-redeemer could protect that land and keep it in the family. Here's the third one. The kinsman-redeemer could redeem the family name through a levirate marriage. Now, a levirate marriage is when a childless widow, when she would lose her husband, if a brother or a close relative would step in as her husband to preserve the family line. Okay, that was an Old Testament stipulation. And what's happened here to Naomi and Ruth is they've lost their family name. Because who did the family name pass through? The men. And so they don't have the men in the family to continue their family name. But if Boaz stepped in, he could perpetuate the family name. And so here we see kinsman redeemers. They could redeem family members sold into slavery. They could redeem land. And they could redeem the family name. Now, in summary, here's what I would say. Ruth and Naomi are in a really, really bad place. And, you know, one thing that certainly Naomi sees in Boaz is that he could step in and God could use him to totally change their future situation. But here's what I really want you to see in Boaz. When you look at the Old Testament, you will see Christ hidden in all the scriptures. Jesus said, all the scriptures are about me. And what Boaz is probably the clearest picture of Jesus Christ in the book of Ruth. He is a picture of Christ our kinsman-redeemer. So look at these parallels of Boaz to Christ. Here's the first one. Christ, our kinsman-redeemer, Christ redeemed us from slavery to sin. And so when Jesus showed up, we were enslaved to sin. We were lost and without hope in the world, and Christ shows up, and he redeems us from that, just as Boaz could protect Ruth and Naomi from slavery to sin. Next, you'll see it up there on the screen, Christ redeemed our property privileges lost in the fall. And so, pre-sin, pre-Adam and Eve sinning, we were in the Garden of Eden, right, through Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve had all these wonderful property privileges, but they lost those at the fall. They essentially lost their land. And Christ showed up and died for us and redeemed us so that in some ways in this life, but especially on the other side of glory, all those property privileges would be redeemed for us. And then here's a third way we see Christ as our kinsman-redeemer. Christ redeemed our family name, the children of God. And this is probably the biggest one in the book of Ruth. Ruth and Naomi, they were going to be left without a name. And Boaz showed up, and he was going to be able to provide them with that. And you know what? When we were alienated from God by our sin, we lost our family name. And you know what? Christ came along. He saved us so that we might be called children of God, adopted into the family of God with all the rights and privileges of being a child of God. Isn't that awesome? And so we see in Boaz, Christ, our kinsman-redeemer. When all hope seemed lost, God sent my Redeemer. Let me just close by asking you this. Have you given your life to our Redeemer? Jesus, he did so much for us. He came, he died on the cross for us. He rose again on the third day for us so that he could restore our family name. He could restore all the privileges we lost at the fall. But have you given your life to him? Have you let him be your Redeemer? If you haven't, here's what you got to do. Confess that you are a sinner. That means repent of your sin. Turn from your sin and place your faith in his finished work. And then you too will have a kinsman-redeemer. His name is Jesus. Amen. I'm going to be over in the prayer room if any of you needs prayer this morning.